I was saying every year about this time, our staff goes through training for CPR. If this makes you feel safer, you're probably overestimating our abilities. Liz Ewer comes in with 11, 12 of her dummy friends, and we spread them on the floor in the chapel. And then the staff take turns getting over her dummy friends and doing what she teaches us to do. She tells us it's 2 breaths and then 30 compressions. I'm going to be careful about this because I know there's a bunch of medical professionals in the room right now getting ready to prove yourselves by correcting what I say. Tell me afterwards if I got this wrong. I think it's 2 breaths and then 30 compressions. And the compressions have to be delivered at about with force and at about the same speed. It's not casual, it's aggressive. She's taught us that we should do it to the tune, staying alive, staying alive. So now you can envision staff in the chapel while they're compressing, doing staying alive, staying alive. And then there's 2 breaths. This year she came back and she told us that if we wanted, we could change the song, I'm not making this up, from staying alive to Another One Bites the Dust. Bum, 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 another one bites the dust, that. So you get the idea. Now, I think it was because after she saw our staff practice, she knew that nobody we were helping was staying alive. They were all biting the dust. So should you lose consciousness, and that's not unheard of in college church, and you are unresponsive and unable to help yourself, should you awaken for a moment, you might pay attention to the song that is being sung while somebody does compression. It could be an omen. You're either staying alive or biting the dust. Now, if I have this right, and here's where the medical professionals can help me, these 2 things work hand in hand because the pressure, the compressions with our hands help circulate the blood throughout the body, but the breathing into the other person's mouth helps oxygenate the blood and hopefully stimulate respiration. In other words, jumpstart the person's breathing, if you will, on their own. How am I doing so far? Am I right? Well, when I was reading this passage in John chapter 20, that was the first image that I had. I thought what we've got is Jesus in a room with 11 of his dummy friends after the resurrection, and he breathes onto them or into them and says, receive the Spirit, and they come back to life. So far, so good. Then I remembered that in the beginning of time, when God formed the man from the dust of the ground, he bent down and breathed into his nostrils the ruah, the breath of life, his own breath, and he became a living soul. The breathing into another person when they are unconscious and unresponsive is taking something that is very personal and inside of you and transmitting it into that other person's lungs. You are, in essence, loaning them your breath until they have their own, because they can't breathe. So now I am picturing God's stooping over this man that he has formed and breathing his own breath into the lungs of that man until it stimulates life and he comes alive and becomes a living soul. I remembered in Ezekiel 37 when the prophet is shown a valley of dry bones, all dead. The word breath is used 2 or 3 different ways in that passage, as wind and as breath and as spirit, all 3. And the prophet is told that the day will come when Yahweh will breathe his breath into Israel and they will come alive. And then about 14 verses later, he says, I will give them my spirit or my breath and they will become alive and they will become a new nation. And suddenly the metaphor changed. What God is doing, I thought to myself, is he is not simply resuscitating someone that is dead. He is creating life that has never existed before. He is forming a new man, or in the case of Ezekiel, forming a new nation by giving those people the breath or the spirit from God's own lungs. Are you with me so far? This is not simply a resurrection. This is a new creation. What God is forming in John 20 has not existed up to this time. And then I remembered something that I was taught a long time ago that changed the way that I read this text. I think everyone in the room knows it, but we forget it. But that's that the Gospels were written much later than we think. The Gospel of John, for instance, was probably written around the year 90 to 95 AD. What that means is that this gospel, these stories were transmitted to the people of God 50 to 60 years after Pentecost. That means that the church was already thriving, growing, meeting in little households. Paul's letters are full of greetings to people that met in households. One says between 30 and 40 people in number. There were no large churches back then. And at the same time, Christianity was being persecuted. Nero would come forward in 65 and start orchestrated persecution of the Christians. In the year 70, he commissioned the building of the Colosseum. In 80, it was done, and they began to feed Christians to beasts in the Colosseum, and that was just one site. There were 3 or 4 other major sites in the Roman Empire where the Christians were being herded up and sent to their deaths because of their convictions and their beliefs. And why this is important is because it means when John wrote this gospel and when he told these stories, he wasn't just telling history so you would know what happens. There was another agenda, I think, and that agenda was to tell the life of Jesus in a way that would inspire Christians who were afraid for their own lives. Their communities were small. Their heroes were all dead. Their religion was against the law. They were being persecuted by the dozens when John sat down to write this letter. And when I remembered that, I started to read the passage differently. Now, I promise I won't say anything you don't already know. This is college church. You guys know everything, so I'll move through this part quickly. First, all of the pronouns in this passage are plural. They're not singular. So Jesus never says peace to you. He says peace to y'all. This means that what Jesus was doing was stepping into a community that was being formed as y'all. He wasn't resuscitating 11 dummies. He was creating something new with his breath, his spirit, out of one new person, like a body, these believers. Second, there is an apparent, if subliminal, structure that carries the story. There is a gathering, followed by a sending, followed by an indwelling. The text says, when they were together, that's the gathering. When they were together, Jesus appeared and showed himself. And they were overjoyed, and he said to them, as the Father sends me, so I'm sending you. So the gathering become the sending. And then as they were going out, he breathed. There is no onto or into in the original. He just exhaled and said, receive the Spirit. And then he gave them the powers of a priest. When you forgive, they're forgiven. When you retain or hold on to it, it is held. And Eugene Peterson says, what are you going to do with it? Third, the peace be with you is not a greeting, it's a gift. He says it twice, not one time. It was a common rabbinical greeting, but he said it twice. He came into the room and said, peace to you, and then showed them his hands and side, and they were overjoyed, and he said it again, peace to you, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. So peace is not something Jesus is just speaking, it is something he is bringing into that room. And there's two ways to figure this out. You can either do a word study if you want, bore the life out of yourself by looking up the meaning of peace, or you can just read the New Testament and ask what is happening in places where Jesus speaks peace. In the New Testament, when Jesus speaks peace, the storm is suddenly calmed down. The forces of nature are made to mind again. They are reordered. When Jesus speaks peace, a woman who was once ashamed is healed of her disease and brought back into her community. When Jesus speaks peace, a woman is elevated in the presence of her peers and sent out into a life of peace. When Jesus speaks peace, two different sides, warring ethnicities, warring tribes become one new humanity. So Jesus comes into the room bringing peace, and nobody in the room has it because they are scared out of their mind. He's not telling them, be at peace. He is bringing to them the peace that he speaks. Are you with me so far? So they are nervous, they are afraid, and Jesus comes and presents himself to that room, and he carries himself what he wants them to have. And as he shows himself to them, peace arises. Which leads to 4. The sending comes in the gathering, not after it. In the midst of their overjoyed, he says, now I'm sending you. Wherever Jesus meets with his disciples, the same thing happens. He doesn't just meet, he always releases them into the world. People, this is crucial for our gatherings. It means that there is a centrifugal power in this room right now if we do it right. If we get worship right, it throws us outward onto the world to carry what we got right in this room. Still there? Yes? Here's the last piece. As they are leaving, he exhales and says, receive the Spirit. And if this seems like an add-on to you, consider what this moment becomes without it. If Jesus does not give them his Spirit in this moment, he is in effect saying in the sending, now go out into the world, people. Good luck out there. But when he gives them his Spirit, he is giving them the very power that animates him. I'll get to the point. Whatever you're doing in your life, you could do it better if you did it in the power of the Holy Spirit. He is a vastly underestimated power in the Christian's life. The Catholics have apostolic succession, and the Protestants have a core set of beliefs. But both of us have underestimated the power of the Holy Spirit when he is released and when he is inhaled by the people of God. He changes the way people live. We ought to be able to do things that we cannot do without the Holy Spirit. Are you there now? So I'll cut to the chase. I think the reason John wrote this story is he's trying to tell a group of young Christians scared out of their minds. People, every time you gather, Christ is present and he presents himself. You say, man, I don't see him. Which is funny because there's some people in this room can't not see him. It's simply a matter of learning to use the faculties for which God has given us to see the resurrected Christ. Are you there? He gave you eyes to see a sunrise, ears to hear a song, and taste buds to taste the fruit. You cannot see a melody. You cannot hear a sunrise. You must use the faculty that God gave you to apprehend the thing he made the faculty for. Even so, God has given you, Christian, faculties for seeing the risen Christ among us. In a moment, when we go to the table, he will present himself again. And if it seems to you like two common, ordinary elements, well, you need to work on those faculties. I think Christians today gather like Christians in that day. I think the predominant, this is just my opinion, I think the predominant mood in Christian gatherings in America today is fear. Anger's close, but I think anger is a response to the fear. I think the predominant spirit in American churches today is fear in the form of suspicion. We are suspicious of the government, we're suspicious of the public, and we're suspicious of each other. It is fear in the form of defensiveness. We are defensive about our rights. We're defensive about our convictions. We are defensive about our beliefs. We're defensive about our freedoms. It is fear in the form of intimidation. We are intimidated by our critics. We are intimidated by our leaders. We are intimidated by each other, our peers. We are intimidated by laws and executive orders. It is fear in the form of uncertainty. We're uncertain about our standing or our reputation, uncertain about our gatherings or our identity. We are uncertain about our chances or our future. What I'm saying is, almost every Sunday when the doors are open, the people of God gather and push back the fear long enough to worship. But worship in America is suspended fear. And then the moment it's over, we go back to what Christians call the real world. And what John is saying is, this is the real world. In the midst of your fear, you gather, and Christ is present in our midst. He reveals himself, and you see him. And when you see him, your confidence in Jesus is greater than your fear of everything else. And then in the midst of your gathering, when your emotions are at the peak and you want to build 3 tents and stay there forever, he turns to you and says, now go, and sends us into the world like he himself was sent. And by the way, on our way out, he exhales, and the people of God are filled with the Spirit as they go. Can you imagine the change in every discipline in the county if the Christians who did those jobs did it in the power and animation of the Holy Spirit? Yeah. So I sat down with these Christians this week. I did. I sat in the corner of the room and pretended that they were in the middle of it. And I picked up Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I tried to imagine what Paul would say to a group of scared Americans who have gathered for worship. And as I read this letter, I'm pretty familiar with it, but as I read it like this, you guys, I begin to hear a voice. And I'll try to put, it's very brief, but I'll try to put words to it. I think he would say, church, whether you know it or not, you are the only hope of the world. You are the presence of the future. God has a plan that he has already started. He is bringing every power in heaven and on earth under the authority of Jesus Christ. And you, despite your limitations and your flaws, which are many, are a central component in that plan. If God could do it without you, he doesn't intend to. You are a representative of the world that is coming. I think he would say to us, you are not a nonprofit organization. You are not a 501c3. You are not a conservative voting bloc. You're not a funding stream for somebody else's ideas. You're not a pool of volunteers for some other cause in Grant County. You are a chosen people, a holy nation, a royal priesthood, a people that God has called out of darkness and brought into light. So you must declare the praises of him who has done this, called you out of darkness and brought you into light. Because once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. You are the works of God. You are the new humanity. You are the household of God. You are a temple or a cathedral to the Almighty. You are a new nation that God is forming within a nation on the earth. I think he would say, so live up to your calling. If this is who you are, your posture should not be one of entitlement, but one of humility. You should not be demanding. You should be gentle. And you shouldn't be critical. You should be patient. You shouldn't correct everybody. You should bear with one another, just as God bears you in Jesus Christ. I think he would say, in your gathering, build one another up. Believe in the body. Stay in the body. Serve the body. Because when the body grows, you grow. But if the body doesn't grow, you're not really growing. You see, sooner or later, everything in the room warms up to room temperature. So you have to pay attention to the culture that you're building when you gather. And when you're sent, remember, you're not just winning souls. You're not just evangelizing people. You're converting them. You're not populating heaven. You're a colony from heaven, living on the earth. Live up to your calling, church. Everything God is going to do someday with the world, He started. It's already here. Look around you. You're thinking, this is as good as it gets? This is as good as it gets. It's us, without all the flaws and the limitations. It's same old ordinary us with the breath of God in our lungs.